Parliamentarians for Human Rights webinar to discuss the role that parliamentarians can play in promoting a just and sustainable economic recovery from COVID-19. And we are very pleased and happy to have so many participants in this seminar, a wide range of members of parliaments as well as their staff from all over Southeast Asia. We are also pleased to welcome non-APHR members, and hopefully at the end of the seminar you can consider joining the ASEAN Parliamentarians for Human Rights. And for those of you who don't know or not familiar with APHR, APHR is a regional organization of activists and advocates of former and current members of parliament. We have about 118 MPs from 8 countries, Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, Thailand, Timor-Leste, Cambodia, Myanmar. Yeah, that's it. No? We have 8 countries represented in APHR, and we use our mandate or our positions to advocate human rights inside and outside of the parliament, regionally, globally, and within our own countries. We also work closely with civil society. We do fact-finding missions, researches, and developing toolkits which parliamentarians can use in their advocacy for human rights and democratic values. And this webinar has been tailored fit for parliamentarians. But we do have staff from parliamentarians in attendance, so we would also encourage you to participate during the discussions and even in answering the questions in our Mentimeter later on. Okay. So following our last session on the topic of enhancing social protection, which we did a couple of weeks ago, today we are meeting for the second session of the series, which will focus on the role parliamentarians can play in protecting workers and boosting employment to contribute to a sustainable and just economic recovery. As we all know, COVID-19 is primarily a health crisis, but it is also an economic crisis. And it has had a devastating impact on the region's economy. Business operations, the food supply chains have been disrupted. There's mass unemployment. Exchange rates have depreciated, tourism is in a standstill, trade and industry has been disrupted. But the pandemic has also revealed major existing inequalities and weaknesses in our governance systems, with the region failing to protect those in the most vulnerable positions. The decisions made today on recovery plans will be shaping our collective future and determining the economic trajectory that the region will take. So we are gathered today to ensure that we, as members of Parliament from Southeast Asia, harness this historic opportunity to build back a stronger, more environment-friendly, and more resilient economy by ensuring that economic recovery plans guarantee environmental sustainability and social justice. This webinar, like the remaining 2 of the series, is a participatory webinar. It is the first and foremost a space to enable parliamentarians to learn from each other and share experience through informal discussions, including discussing possibilities for collaboration across countries. So we do encourage parliamentarians to not just share the experiences, but even ask questions from fellow parliamentarians. And maybe at the end of the day, we can develop some exploratory, collaboratory efforts. So now we will start with the session by going through this afternoon's agenda. First, we are very pleased to have Ms. Panuda Bunpala, the Regional Deputy Director of the International Labor Organization Asia Pacific Office. Ms. Bunpala will present to members of Parliament the different best practices and measures available for parliamentarians to protect workers and boost employment in the economic recovery from COVID-19. After her, she's given 10 minutes for her speech or for her sharing. And then after her, we will have Representative Stella Kimbo from the House of Representatives of the Philippines, who will speak about her own experience in protecting workers in the economic recovery in the Philippines in her role as the main author of the Philippine Arise Bill. Then we will have a short session for questions, answers, and clarifications. I think our two speakers would have to leave us by 4, so we'll make sure that the question and answer will be over before 4 o'clock. But our speakers will also be joined by Dr. Muhammad Hidayat Greenfield, who is the Regional Secretary of the IUF Trade Union. And he will be answering the questions during the Q&A and also giving a short informal presentation in the second half of the session to jumpstart the discussions, or the second informal discussion. After the question and answer, we will have 2 sets of moderated informal discussions between the participants. And again, I encourage everyone, staff and MPs, to participate during the discussions. First, we will assess together the status of the integration of social protection in Southeast Asia, in the Southeast Asia recovery packages, and analyze where there is room for improvement and intervention. And in a second step, we will discuss the next steps needed to achieve this objective and how we in APHR can support you in achieving these next steps. So before, I would like to ask the Regional Deputy Director of the ILO Asia Pacific Office to present the measures that regional MPs can take to protect workers and boost employment in the economic recovery from COVID-19 in Southeast Asia. Ms. Panuda Bunpala, you have the floor, ma'am.
Thank you so much, honorable members of parliament and senators, the current and the former ones and their staff, APHR colleagues and secretariat. Thank you so much for inviting the ILO to be part of this very important webinar. I'm so pleased to see strong interest among parliamentarians in ASEAN countries in our region. The topic that I was assigned to speak, I mentioned to Kanel the other day, actually, when we spoke about it briefly. It's really too early to talk about good practices and best practices when we come to try to find ways to deal with the COVID response and the socio-economic recovery. I think we all are working together, trying to find ways to find solutions together. The ILO has come up with a number of policy recommendations, working with member states and social partners. And I share a PowerPoint with Kanel today by email, and that PowerPoint can be shared with the participants as background information. But for the purpose of our webinar today, let me also touch upon the context of ASEAN briefly. The COVID-19 clearly has a massive impact in the world of work. We have heard so much about business closing, workers losing work. We know that unemployment now is much bigger than before. But at the same time, I think we have to work together to find solutions. And I'm very pleased that at the ASEAN level, there are a number of initiatives, including this one among parliamentarians, to come together. In terms of the context that we are looking at in ASEAN, some of the sectors which are most affected by the COVID-19 includes accommodation and food services, wholesale and retail trade, real estate, manufacturing. And for these core sectors of the ASEAN economy, we have some 130 million workers in this sector, which is basically about 40% of ASEAN workforce that will be or have been affected or be affected as we go forward. Informal economy is very much a feature of ASEAN economy. More than 70% of workers in ASEAN are in the informal economy, and some 200 million informal workers, and many of them are women, are affected. Their livelihood destroyed, and they are not they are not often protected in the national social security system. And this is really crucial and central. And I understand that in the last session, you already spoke about this at length. It's very important to find much better way to protect workers and also businesses in the informal economy as a whole. Talking about businesses, some 50 million enterprises in ASEAN face risk of serious disruption, and many of these are in MSME sectors. And in terms of response, we acknowledge that ASEAN countries have been pretty quick in coming up with many stimulus packages. And the positive aspect I'd like to mention is that certainly in some countries, such as Thailand, is able to make use of digital technologies to reach out to informal economy workers to some extent. More has to be done. But at the same time, the negative aspects of the stimulus packages is that some groups are left out, such as migrant workers. One observation about stimulus packages in ASEAN countries, higher income countries such as Singapore and Thailand to some extent have been able to have much larger stimulus packages than some other countries like Myanmar and Cambodia, and that is understandable. And the average among the ASEAN countries actually is about 4.2% of the GDP have been used for the stimulus packages. I think this afternoon we can hear more how the money is being targeted in different stimulus packages. And we look forward to learn about lessons from the Philippines from Honorable Ms. Stella Kimbo later. And of course, we also can hear more from the trade union perspective about the protection of workers from Dr. Muhammad as well. The ILO, from our side, we are compiling the analysis on how these stimulus packages have been implemented, their coverage, and where are some of the gaps. And we'll be in the position to share the analysis in the near future. Today, let me mention a few examples that I think are very positive. The first one, I think the Philippines Department of Labor and Employment, the way they have allocated budget towards an emergency employment program that benefits informal sector workers, I think it's a good practice. The second one, Indonesia, which has set up pretty large employment-intensive cash for work program to support job creation and community infrastructures in rural villages. I think this is also a very good initiative. And I mentioned quite a bit about MSMEs and how important for them to really get support so that they can survive in the economy, but they're also important source of jobs and employment and livelihoods. I think among ASEAN countries, we have seen, of course, all governments have been working towards supporting MSME, but I'd like to mention Brunei. The government of Brunei is providing 25% salary subsidies for Bruneian employees in micro and small and medium enterprises, particularly those with less than 100 employees for a period of 3 months. I think this kind of initiative is very important. The government of Thailand is investing in domestic tourism by financing subsidies and other benefits in order to support jobs in a sector that has been hard hit by the pandemic. So these are some of the initiatives in our region, in ASEAN region, which I think are very, very promising. There should be more, and I'm sure there are more. So what next towards building back better and towards the recovery that benefit workers, that protect workers? The first, I would propose that I think when we look at the policy and the legislative reforms in the process of recovery, it's very important to give priority to formalization of informal economy. I think all countries in ASEAN need regulatory environment which support sustainable enterprises, support organization of MSME, support cooperative, support associations of small producers, for example. Also, we need a regulatory environment that support workers' organization, provide them with social protection, and ensure minimum wages. Very often, minimum wages in the informal economy as a whole has been overlooked for too long. And it is central that minimum wages in the informal economy must be guaranteed. And there is really super urgent the need to look into the national security law to expand the coverage to cover informal economy workers overall. Beyond that, I think the need to relook at the current scenario of various legislative frameworks such as the Employment Act, Labor Protection Act, Occupational Safety and Health Law, Maternity Protection Act. Just take a close look to what extent this legal framework in the current scenario of COVID recovery can support job creation, can support retention of workers, and particularly the focus on the vulnerable groups and the vulnerable workers. And the other point that is so important for ASEAN region to look at it together, the plight of migrant workers. They deserve special attention. The policy, the legal framework, the immigration-related law, the anti-trafficking law, and the labor market demands. All of these have to be looked into it together in the integrated manner rather than separately as things have been in the past. Cash for work programs. I think this is so important. I mentioned the good example from Indonesia. It's so important to have cash for work program to support workers who are at the moment out of job. They need quick support. But of course, many of these cash for work programs, they are also support the local economic development. It's not that kind of values that also can help reduce inequality and poverty at the local level. Child labor prevention is so important. We know that the pandemic, so many families now become poor. We know that so many children have been pushed out of their schools. The risk of child labor to return in ASEAN countries is quite severe. It's quite strong. And we know that there are ongoing child labor problems in agriculture, in palm oil, in mining. So I think it's very important to look at child labor prevention and see whether the current legal framework and all policy measures to combat child labor is comprehensive enough, is effective enough in their implementation. Youth employment. It's so important to ensure that young people rights at work are protected and they are treated equally and they are protected from abuse and hazardous work. And my last point, social dialogue, social dialogue, social dialogue. This is the time for stakeholders to really come together, government, employers, workers. There's no other way if the constituents, the stakeholders don't come together to find the best solutions. We don't have other ways. This is the time that dialogue is needed more than ever. From the ILO side, what can we support? What can we do? The ILO has international labor standards as a guide for all countries to benefit from. Your work in the legal reform, in the legislative reform, you can make use of the international labor standards as a guide. We have a bunch of experts which can provide direct technical support at the country level. Give us a call, send us email, contact our country offices in the region for support. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Bunpala, for giving us an overview of the situation of our laborers in the region, as well as what countries or governments are doing or initiating in order to protect laborers' rights, and also for your concrete general suggestions on what parliamentarians can do. And I really like the last point on dialogue, dialogue, and dialogue. Despite the layoffs and the employment, let's hope we can prevent labor unrest with dialogues. So now let's proceed to our next speaker. We shall have Representative Stella Kimbo from the House of Representatives of the Philippines, and may I say my own party mate, who will speak about her own experience in protecting workers in the economic recovery in the Philippines in her role as the main author of the Philippine Arise Bill. Stella, please.
Thank you, Teddy, and a pleasant afternoon to everyone. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me and for this opportunity to talk about legislative efforts in my country, particularly on pump priming the economy. And this afternoon, I'd like to share with you some information about this bill, which we call Arise Philippines. It's an acronym for Accelerated Recovery and Investment Stimulus for the Economy of the Philippines. So it's a mouthful, but it's pretty much an economic stimulus package with the intention really to protect workers from layoff. And we do that by promoting business continuity as well as reviving business confidence, including consumer confidence and worker confidence. Next, please. All right, so just for a little bit of context, we began lockdown very early in the game. March 15 was when we started. And so during this time, during the lockdown, or what we call enhanced community quarantine, only businesses in essential sectors were allowed to operate. And so this was about 20% of economic sectors. This, of course, would include the food sector, including farms, restaurants, groceries, markets, as well as those in healthcare, so hospitals, testing labs, of course, etc. So the remainder were the non-essential businesses. So they were not allowed to operate, but many of them continued to shoulder payroll expense. They continued to pay for their loans. They continued to pay for lease payments. And so our assessment is that clearly they would be facing liquidity concerns by now. So we were most worried about the non-essential sectors because of liquidity issues. March 24, shortly after the lockdown began, Congress passed the Bayanihan to Heal as One Act. And Bayanihan here is the Filipino term for social solidarity. And so this bill provides for healthcare spending as well as social amelioration. So the thing in the Philippines is that many workers are what are called no work, no pay. So the thing with the lockdown is that many of our workers stopped receiving pay because they don't receive monthly salaries, but rather they're paid daily or piece rates. And so to address the need of our no work, no pay workers, then the Bayanihan to Heal as One Act was passed by Congress. And so again, provided for cash subsidies to the bottom 75% of households, wage subsidies provided to formal MSMEs. So there are about 1 million formally registered MSMEs or micro, small, and medium enterprises in the Philippines. But I think MSMEs in the informal sector would run to about easily 5 to 6 million. So easing up of the lockdown began by locality in May. However, shortly after that, Canel, can you please go back to the first slide? I just want to show our epidemic curve. So as you can see, when we lifted our lockdown, May 30, as you can see the curve, this would be the curve for new cases. It's sort of started to rise somewhat continuously. And so going back, Canel, to the next slide. And so the response of government, beginning August 4, we are back on lockdown. So we now have a 2-week lockdown from August 4 to August 18 in the Metro Manila and area and the nearby provinces. So which means, again, no public transportation and work in non-essential businesses would mostly be from home. Next, please. So that's the situation in the Philippines. And what we have here is the timeline for the Arise bill. I actually filed the first economic stimulus bill very early on, March 12. This was a few hours before the announcement of the first lockdown. Shortly after that, another MP, Congressman Salceda, also filed another economic stimulus bill. By April 14, the Speaker of the House convened an economic stimulus subcommittee. And so there are 3 co-chairs of that committee, including myself. And we were tasked to consolidate all economic stimulus bills, which at the time may be numbered around 10. And so from April to May was actually what I consider the most important step in the crafting of this bill, which what Ms. Boonpala mentioned earlier. This was where we had dialogue. We talked to government agencies. We assessed the ability of government agencies to implement our proposed interventions. We talked to stakeholders. We talked to labor groups, business groups, all sizes, small and big. Of course, we also had to talk to our academe to find out if we were going towards the right direction. And so by the end of May, we were ready with our consolidated bill. And at this point in time, we had about 280 co-authors in this bill. And the total MPs is about 302. So about 90% of the MPs signed off as co-authors. Many of them actually proposed provisions, if not amendments, to this bill. So there was a deep sense of ownership over this bill. So it was an easy period of sponsorship as well as debate, as well as amendments. And so by June 4, we were able to approve this on third and final reading. But that was the last day that was our last session, day before adjournment. And so we were not able to have Senate approval. So by June 4, we were able to transmit it to the Senate, but of course, there was no time left to also get a Senate approval. So at this point in time, we are still actually waiting for the Senate to make a move on this bill. But meanwhile, what's interesting is that just last night, Congress passed a Bayanihan Part 2 bill. And what is Bayanihan Part 2 bill? Bayanihan Part 2 is actually a smaller version of the Bayanihan 1 bill. So it also seeks to address social amelioration as well as healthcare spending. And Bayanihan Part 2, curiously, took a lot of provisions from ARISE. So it's like Bayanihan 2 is like the child of ARISE. However, the amounts proposed for Bayanihan Part 2 is much smaller compared to the amounts proposed under ARISE. ARISE proposes about 3.5% of GDP for 2020, but Bayanihan Part 2 is a much smaller bill and proposes less than 1% of GDP. So I personally view Bayanihan Part 2 as maybe a stopgap measure, particularly to address the damage or the economic losses that would arise resulting from the lockdown. Next, please. Next slide, please, Canal. Again, just for context, I mentioned earlier that the bill really is about protecting workers from layoff. We have about 41 million workers in the country, and we assessed early on that it would be workers in the non-essential sectors that would really be most affected by the pandemic, because obviously government workers would be able to keep their jobs, workers in private households as well, including employees in the essential businesses, because they were allowed to operate anyway during the lockdown. And that, however, is just about 9 million workers. The rest of the workers, about 29 million of them, are actually vulnerable to the risk of layoffs. And as of end April, we've actually recorded the highest unemployment level ever since 1956. Our unemployment rate right now is 17.7%, and that's equivalent to 7.3 million Filipinos without jobs. Next, please. I hope you're able to see the very small font, but this is a summary of the ARISE interventions. There are 5 kinds of interventions. The first would be a general kind of intervention, which is a proposal to spend on mass testing. Early on, we had a problem with ramping up testing, and so we felt that testing is really important to bring back confidence into the workplace. As soon as we reopen the economy, it is very important that workers feel confident to return to the workplace, that consumers are confident to return to the marketplace. And so that's the first intervention. We also have what we call transitional or stopgap measures. So this would include what Ms. Boonpala mentioned earlier, cash for work, for example, as well as unemployment assistance. We also propose wage subsidies, which I believe Singapore has done. Of course, we also have regulatory relief measures, particularly for the larger businesses, which we think will not be able to obviously receive cash assistance because we intend to prioritize the MSMEs under this bill. And second, we have financial interventions, which would include zero interest loans. And because 77% of Filipinos continue to be unbanked, credit mediation is also very important, meaning to say we need to be able to provide holding hand services hand-holding services for the unbanked. Now, we need to be able to connect the small businesses to the formal financial institutions. We also have loan guarantees proposed here because, again, many would not have collateral. So obviously the next best substitute would be credit guarantees. Although the bill says all critically impacted businesses, regardless of where you are, so regardless of your sector and regardless of size, as long as you show proof that you are critically impacted by the pandemic, you are entitled to, or you are eligible to some form of assistance. However, we assess that there are some sectors that are more critically impacted, and these four would be the tourism sector, exporters. 3 would be public transportation, because obviously social distancing would mean capacity would be down to 50%. 4th would be agriculture, because although agriculture was not a non-essential business, in other words, they were allowed to operate. Of course, food security is of utmost importance today, particularly if we won't be able to import the usual food stuff from our neighboring countries. And finally, we would have structural interventions, and this would include an enhancement of our Build program, particularly infrastructure that would improve our internet speeds. The Philippines, unfortunately, has one of the slowest internet speeds in the world. It's also intended to expand our bandwidth. Particularly, we want to make sure that all schools, now that we are shifting to hybrid learning, all schools must have internet access. Currently, only 26% of our public schools have internet access. Next, please. So in total, we propose, can you go back? I just want to show the amounts, Canel. We propose $14.16 billion for 2020, 6.8 for 2021, and $5.28 billion for 2022. So in pesos, it's about 1.3 trillion pesos for 3 years. Next, please. So of course, as soon as we passed the bill, our main obstacle was that the economic managers of our country, meaning the Department of Finance as well as our Economic Planning Agency, said that these amounts are not fundable. So they raised the issue of the availability of funds. Canel, can you please move to the next slide? So what we proposed actually as sources of finance are 2, basically savings. So there are some clearly budget items like foreign travel, for instance, that clearly would not be able to be spent effectively during the pandemic. So that can be considered as savings and therefore be used for purposes of economic stimulus. But more importantly, we think that the more important source would be loans. Because the Philippines has a very good credit rating. In fact, recently we actually had an upgrade. And so now is the best time to use that upgraded credit rating and use loans in order to pump prime the economy. So, however, as I mentioned earlier, economic managers said RISE is not fundable. We don't have funds available. And more importantly, they raised some constitutionality issues, which I think is not really fatal. I think there would be enough jurisprudence to say that that can be set aside. Next, please. of course, the more important question at this point in time is, can we afford not to arise? In other words, what would happen if we don't undertake this economic stimulus? So as I mentioned earlier, we passed Bayanihan 2. It's a much smaller version of Arise. Of course, we're happy that at least some funds would be forthcoming, but I personally worry that it's too small, especially now this morning, our economic managers announced a minus 16% contraction of our second quarter GDP. So again, that's a record low. And so given that our economy is contracting in a big way, I personally believe that we really need to have a big enough amount of economic stimulus here. So what will happen if we don't arise? So again, the most important sector that will be hit, I believe, would be labor, because at this point in time, businesses will not be able to sell their assets. They cannot dispose of their assets because no one will buy your assets. And besides, you don't want to dispose of your assets at a very low price. And so unfortunately, the most vulnerable would really be workers, because they are the most dispensable, unfortunately, at this point in time. Is there a common ground? So I hope that apart from Bayanihan 2, which will be a law soon by early next week, I still hope that the Senate will pass a version of the Arise that will allow the funding of the remainder of what we believe is the required amount of economic stimulus. So I'll end there. That's where we are at this point.
Thank you very much, Representative Stella. Before the second informal discussion, we will have a presentation from Muhammad Hiyadat Greenfield. He is the Regional Secretary of the IFU Trade Union. So, Hiyadat.
Yep. Thank you, Teddy. Thanks and good afternoon. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak. My international union, and I'm responsible for the Asia Pacific region, we cover workers in agriculture, farms, plantations, food processing, beverages, right through to hotels and tourism. And so our members have been very much affected in all of these sectors. In terms of the challenges I would like to talk about, I think the first and foremost, and something that I'm working on, and in fact, I'm forced to travel at the moment because I'm working on it. I'm reluctantly traveling. I'm in Dubai at the moment. Is that we really need to recognize and get more governments to recognize COVID-19 as an occupational disease, to acknowledge that for workers in all industries, not just in healthcare, there is a risk of exposure to COVID-19, and that this risk will continue for another 1 or 2 years, even after the pandemic has ended. And that recognition of the SARS-CoV-2 as a biological agent and COVID-19 as an occupational disease, that's what I work on, is essential in all industries. Because while a lot of employers might be introducing distancing and masks and these kinds of things, all they're doing is taking the public health regulations and trying to apply it in the workplace without changing much how work is done and work processes and work arrangements. And I think that is a real challenge. That's one of the reasons why, despite having masks, temperature checks, hand washing and distancing, we still have outbreaks of COVID-19 cases in food factories, food processing, especially in the meat industry. And some countries now have closed down completely in some states, their meat industry, where there's the highest incidence of COVID-19 cases because of the way the work is done, because of proximity, cold temperatures, and so on. And so I think it's really important that in ASEAN, in order to restore confidence, but also as a slightly longer term view, recognition of COVID-19 as an occupational disease is important, and then to regulate that, to make sure that it's not left up to employers what part of it they implement or not, but it's more tightly regulated. We really have to crack down on this in order to eliminate the risk from the workplace. I really appreciate Kun Kasit's comments about the longer term. Certainly we're concerned about the longer term impact on employment. I think in understanding the big picture in the longer term, we also have to acknowledge that a lot of the problems we're facing now in the loss of, since all of the growth since the Asian financial crisis in 1998 will be wiped out by the end of this year. That's 22 years of growth will be gone by the end of this year at the current rate. And if that's the case, it really suggests that the export-oriented growth model, a growth model dependent on foreign investment, has not been working. And so any kind of Build Back Better program and economic recovery cannot rely on that again. The economy has been too fragile. It took 6 months to knock out 22 years of growth, and that meant that it was such a fragile, vulnerable economy. We need to build back a more resilient economy, and to do that, we have to look at work. One of the things we're concerned about is that the job losses were so dramatic and so quick, partly because so many workers were casualized, outsourced, contractualized, and already had insecurity in their work and were eliminated so quickly. And in coming back to that discussion of the informal sector, yes, the government should support through social protection and financial assistance small and medium enterprises and self-employed. But there's so much of the informal sector now that came out of outsourcing and contractualization of the formal sector. So I'll give you an example. We've got the biggest problems and I deal with some of the biggest companies, Nestle, Coca-Cola, Unilever, Danone, and others that I talk to about their health and safety protocols and employment. What it comes down to is that a lot of the jobs that they thought were not essential, like cleaning, which is so vital now, was outsourced on minimum wage. And that was informalized over the last 15 years. Housekeeping in hotels, which is so vital now to restoring the confidence of guests and customers and ensuring a safe workplace, and cleaning rooms. We really need to restore confidence. And we have a Safe Hotels campaign that tries to restore confidence as part of the recovery of tourism. But housekeeping over the last 15 years is completely outsourced. It's underpaid, it's overworked, it's undervalued. And yet it's so vital now to everyone's health and safety in a hotel. So if we don't have policies that recognize the value of work, of different kinds of work, of cleaning, of housekeeping, for example, food delivery services, fast food, these aren't hobbies anymore. These aren't part-time jobs. These are real jobs that are vital and essential that need real wages. And I think that we need policies that recognize that, to formalize that. A lot of that food delivery is not self-employed. It's just structured that way. It's a hidden employment relationship. We need those food delivery workers who are so vital during this lockdown and will continue to be recognized as waged employees and therefore protected by labor laws and have a right to join a union. And I think, everything about the value of work is being challenged now. I think it's an important time to start recognizing the importance of these jobs, especially in food processing, food services, food catering, food delivery, and also in hotels. And as I said, for example, housekeeping. It's really unfortunate that a lot of hotels that are reopening now are going back to the old way of outsourcing their cleaning and housekeeping to the lowest bidder on less than minimum wage. That puts everyone at risk all over again. You get 3 or 4 COVID-19 outbreaks in a tourist area like Bali or Phuket, it will damage the reputation of everyone. So we're really pushing through our unions in those places a better reputation, but also a better practice of safe hotels, ensuring that it's safe not only for guests, but for workers too. And I think that's going to be a big challenge. And we've had examples of where big international hotel chains should have retained their employees and they didn't. They've let them go. Now that tourism's starting to recover in some of the countries in ASEAN, they're not ready. Malaysia, for example, a big integrated resorts group laid off 3,000 workers 1 month ago, and now they have a labor shortage and they can't reopen fully and take advantage of the recovery. And they're actually missing out on a business opportunity. So our view is hotel tourism workers make a contribution. To retain them and not fire them is an investment. They need skilled, experienced people ready to reopen those hotels and resorts safely and to restore people's confidence. I just wanted to say that. And finally, I just think that going forward for us, it's really important that we abandon the reference to the ease of doing business of the World Bank. It is clear that all of the fragility of the economy that was exposed in this pandemic it came with the advice of trying to follow the ranking and move up the ranking of the ease of doing business of World Bank, of deregulating, of having more flexibility. That created fragility. So it's very important, and too many governments in ASEAN now still refer to the ease of doing business and their ranking as some kind of progress. But there's clearly, we're not making progress if we've inbuilt all this fragility. So, set aside the ease of doing business. End of the day, and again, I spend a lot of time, unfortunately, dealing with transnational companies and their global management. I'm going to a meeting now. I just want to say that we must remember that all this foreign capital, these foreign companies need ASEAN. We have to get away from the idea that you need to attract that investment. They need ASEAN. They need the ASEAN markets. It's a massive market for them for future growth. Their growth of these companies depends on ASEAN. You don't need to make any concessions at all. They need to prove they're worth coming, investing and creating jobs. They don't need concessions and tax breaks or incentives at all. And that's from the inside of talking to these companies. And I'm afraid, and I hope you can work on this in your respective parliaments. A lot of the companies that I deal with are dealing with a financial crisis, not in ASEAN, where they've done very well in the food processing, beverage industry, and done quite well. They had their crisis in Europe and North America, so they're transferring a lot of their revenue and wealth internally back to Europe and North America and out of ASEAN. And that's going to put us in crisis. Our members will be losing jobs in Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, Myanmar, not because they've done anything wrong or business is down, but because the companies are trying to subsidize their losses in Europe. And we really have to find a way to put a stop to that. I think there's a very positive outlook, as far as I'm concerned, for food processing jobs. I'm more worried about agriculture and food security, but maybe we'll find another time to talk about that. Thank you. Thanks, Teddy.
Thanks. And we would like to thank all our speakers and our participants who joined us in this webinar. Thank you very much.